Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 4th chapter in the book of Acts. We made it all the way up to verse 23. We're going to take it from 24 all the way home to 37, and we just need to review the context, establish the narrative context, which really begins in the 3rd chapter when John and Peter are walking in on the way to the temple, and who but a man lame from birth should ask them for alms, and he says, "Silver and gold have I none, but in the name of Yahshua Messiah, rise up and walk." And he's amazed, and he's proud, shouting, and he's proclaiming, and he's just nothing but praise, and everyone recognizes him. And then Peter launches into the sermon, but by the time we get to the 4th chapter, he says, He approaches a Jewish audience, so he relies a lot on he references the patriarchs and Moses and prophets and everything else, the covenant, Abraham, once more. But by the time we get to the 4th chapter, the temple guard shows up, and they essentially seize them and haul them in jail for the night, and then they are dragged to a tribunal with them, verse 7, and having placed them in the middle, they ask them, "By what power or in what name did you do this?" Peter is spirit-saturated, he's filled with the Ruach Kadesh, and he answers thus, "Rulers of the people and elders of Israel, if today we are called to account for a good deed towards a sick man by whom he has been healed, let it be known to all of you and to all the people in Israel that in the name of Yahshua Messiah of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom Yahweh raised from the dead, by him this one stands before you healthy." So they hold nothing back. They know that's the answer that's going to get them angry. They don't care anyway. They are not going to deny or forsake the name, especially when it is working wonders on their behalf. And so they gave this man who was born lame, and they accuse them of orchestrating a fraud, and they want to know this name. They don't surrender to the name. Rather than, they're just worried about stamping out and killing the man in the movement, because they're distraught to even see the movement of this messianic pretender, which as per customs came and went, and then when they die, their followings outlive them. But this man has something special attached to him. "And there is no salvation in anyone else, for there is no other name under the heavens given among men by which we must be saved." So there's a power in the name, the power unto salvation. We are saved in the name, by the name, and through the name. The name is more than a name. It is more than a mere mark of identity. It is the power and character and nature of the one to whom it belongs. When we refer to the capital N-A, capital N, lowercase a-M-E, that is a divine entity, so there's no strictly speaking separation between the name and the being when we refer to divinity, and that name is sufficient and able to accomplish our salvation, and the imperative of our salvation is communicated in the word must. So we must be saved. We have to be saved in the name, because there's no other way. "And seeing the boldness of Peter and John, and perceiving that they were unlearned and ordinary men, they marveled, and they recognized that they had been with Yahshua." So these are the educated establishment. These are the ones who had the pedigrees, the doctorals, these were the recognized figures. The Sanhedrin were the custodians and upholders. These men weren't even formally educated, yet they were doing wonders, and yet they spoke with such power, and they realized that they spoke with authority, and the authority was not their own. They knew that they belonged to Yahshua, and when we belong to him, anything we belong to belongs to us. So when we belong to him, his power can reside and indwell in us and protect us in our hour of dilemma. And so they're fed up. They said what they didn't want to hear, but they were amazed by what they did hear. Verse 16, saying, "What shall we do to these men? For indeed that an outstanding miracle has been done through them is apparent to all dwelling in Jerusalem, and we are unable to deny it." So that the irrefutable evidence that everyone had seen, they had raised this man, everyone had seen him do it. What they did is he picked him up, and on his way up, he was able to stand firm on his feet in the 3rd chapter. But they want to know what they can't punish them for doing a miracle. They know they said they may have thought it was a hoax or something. So that's why they gathered them. That's why they had their pretext. but they simply mitigate the sentence, saying you cannot any longer teach. And what they say is, but Peter and John answering them said, whether it is right in the sight of Elohim to listen to you more than to Elohim, you judge. For it is impossible for us to not speak what we saw and heard. So this is a moment of obedience and a test. So they're saying, they respect their authority as the Sanhedrin, but they have a higher authority working on their behalf. And what he says to us, we cannot resist the urge of the Ruach Kadesh. These men were spirit saturated. The ones who were interrogating them were strangers to the Spirit. They had missed it and resisted it and rejected it, and they had killed the name, and they were determined to do to the one to the following. But it's qualified in the 22nd verse that the man was over 40 years old, so he was lame from birth and 40 years old. And they went released and reported to the chief priests and said to them, now we find them at a new location. They are perhaps in the same upper room where we find them in the second half of the first chapter of Acts. This may have been their central gathering place. Verse 24, fourth chapter of Acts, lesson itself. And having heard that, they lifted up their voice to Elohim with one mind and said, Yahweh, you are Elohim, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. So they are inclined to praise. This is the benefit of being blessed. Once we do that, we are not absolved of the obligation to offer praise and gratitude to the one who has blessed us. This is the symptom of being spirit saturated. You will always have a word of praise on your tongue, and they have the same clarity of mind. They are praying collectively with the same. We witness that they say it, so they say it in tandem, and they're saying that. They're acknowledging his creative prowess, his omnipotence. He made the heavens, he made the earth and the sea and everything that is them. He is life. He is the source of life. He is the author of life. He is the finisher of life. The power of life and death lies in his hands. And for the life after the death, our ticket is the resurrection, whom they are being persecuted for their proclamation of. So the resurrection was real because the apostles never denied the resurrection, and no one dies for what they know to be a lie. Who by the mouth of your servant David have said, why did the Gentiles rage, and why did the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against Yahweh and against his Messiah. So they're referencing the second psalm, which is a messianic psalm. I think it's the 7th verse. So the Gentiles, they were raging and they were plotting in vain because there is no power aligned against. You cannot thwart what the Almighty has ordained, Isaiah 14:27. But the kings, there's something about the world that's always at war with God and God's people. And David, could speak as the Gentiles as his enemies and Yahweh's enemies as the same in the 139th psalm. But these kings had gathered together. In their present day, it was Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas. Pontius Pilate was reluctant and resistant to consent to his crucifixion, so his sin was not as great as the one who had delivered them there. But for truly in this city there were gathered together against your sacred servant, Yahshua, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. So he identifies Herod. He is the native ruler. He is of Idumean stock, that is Edomite descent. And he is the puppet king, the son of Herod the Great, who has a tetrarchy, and Pontius Pilate governs, and he rules nominally, but he's really a Roman puppet. So these are the kings that are against Yahweh's anointed, and his sacred servant. He is the servant songs in Isaiah, beginning in the 41st chapter, most famous one, the 53rd, tell us about the role he came to fulfill. He came as a servant, and he defined leadership as the ability to serve. So it's a paradox. Our ministry, our leadership in the church is servant, and rather we don't have servants, we serve others. To do whatever your hand and your purpose decided before to be done. So they were agents, and they were the mercy. They were pawns in his providence. They thought they were protecting their interests. Pilate thought, I'm on thin ice with Rome because I've had a few controversies with these Jewish people. He's not completely kept them under control, and he's responded with violence. So he gave them a bone that was his, but he was doing it all because it was providentially ordained, even though he was just protecting his own self-interest. So Yahweh is in control from the start to the finish, the beginning, the end, everywhere in between. He is always in control. And now, Yahweh, look upon their threats and give to your servants all boldness to speak your words. This reminds us of Timothy, where Paul instructs his pastoral protege that he has given us a spirit not of timidity, but of courage. So when we witness in the Spirit, in the power and the presence of the Spirit, there is a boldness that comes across. It's not, you have to say this with meaning, and you can communicate your testimony most effectively with boldness when you're out in public, out in the open, just giving it your all with complete abandon. There's a boldness that requires, and we who publicly preach the good news require boldness in our presentation of it. By stretching out your hand for healing and signs and wonders to take place through the name of your sacred servant, Yahshua. So his providence, his webs all gather and congregate, the interlocking webs of providence, which are agents and actors moving about in the cosmic scheme. But they're all under his control. All the miracles and the signs which they did through the name of the Son, they were acknowledging that it was in his power, in his name, and in his presence that they were able to uplift the beggar from paralysis, lifetime paralysis, 40 years old, never walked in his life. That was not them. It was the sign and wonder that came from the name of the servant who was sacred, Yahshua. And when they had prayed, the place where they came together was shaken, and they were all filled with the Ruach Kadesh, and they spoke the word of Yahweh with boldness. So the shakingness, the physical sound that is divinity speaking to him, acknowledging that he has heard their prayer and has answered it, that prayer was pleasing and acceptable. We just evaluated it word for word, line for line. It's a really poignant and correct application of the Old Testament, which leads into some original material. They make the connection of the kings being the fulfillment of what David wrote over 1,000 years ago. So remember, these are unlettered men, unlearned, yet they're familiar with the Old Covenant scriptures, and it does inform a lot of the New Testament. And they're filled with the Spirit. This is the standard state of existence ever since Pentecost. Everything they do, they're in the Spirit, and they're able to wield wonders, and it's truly miraculous, the results of early Christianity, how we spread from, they were numbered 5,000 people by this time, the fourth verse of this chapter indicates, and how they grew to conquer a continent and an empire. Just miraculous from start to finish. And of course, being Spirit saturated, that's how you know that you are preaching in the Spirit, when there's a boldness that comes across you, and it's obvious and palpable, and you'll recognize it, and you'll know the futility of resistance once it comes. And the group of those who believed were one heart and one soul, and no one claimed any of his possessions was his own, but they had all in common. So this was communalism, the system of economy, where there are no private possessions, no personal property. Everything is held in common. But they were able to do this because they were of one heart. They were not they embraced the calling to deny themselves. Self-denial is key to a discipleship. So when you exist in a Christian brotherhood, you have to deny yourself. And some of them who are wealthier, and we read one who is generous, Barnabas, who we're going to meet, who also plays an instrumental role in the remainder of Acts. And with great power the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of Yahshua, of the Master Yahshua, and great grace was upon them all. So grace is the enabling power. It is not only the power of salvation, it is the power of a Spirit-saturated witness. And they had this boldness and great power. The power was not their own, but it was the one to whom they gave witness to, the one who was resurrected, the one who had visited them and whose name they had healed. That is the one who the power came from. The resurrection was their motivation and incentive. They had to tell the story. Anyone who lives to tell the tale lives to tell the tale. So we are witnesses. We accept their testimony of the resurrection. Every generation of Christian has since, and the resurrection is what marks us as Christians. It is a central yet controversial claim, and that it indicates the divinity of the one we call the namesake of our religion. But grace is anything is possible from grace. We just want to keep that in our grace is the unmerited favor. So these apostles were not educated theologians, yet they spoke powerfully and profoundly through the power of the Spirit, sufficiently to mitigate the Sanhedrin's weight of their judgment against them. They had no choice but to let them go because the entire crowd was in their corner because they had all seen it. There was no avenue of deniability, and they could deny the resurrection, but they couldn't deny this one. For there was not anyone needy among them, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the prices of what was sold. So we do meet a greedy one, needy, where need only exists because of greed. So when you have the equilibrium where everyone's needs and provisions are taken care of, what happens is others get greedy, and the greedy ones were Ananias and Sapphira. We meet them in the earliest part of the next chapter. They are the one who lied. They kept back the proceeds of their sale of their house. They probably donated a more substantial sum, but they had ineffectively bet against it, and then they lied to the Spirit, earning their instant death. So there were violations for, forsaking the equilibrium of your due. Like the widow who cast in the 2 pennies, giving of all she had, these disciples had to be the same way, no matter what they had, whether they were wealthy or not. They had to give it all in, and that because this was the factor, there was none needy among them, but there was a greedy couple who were smitten for their insolence. And laid them at the feet of the apostles, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. So by the 6th chapter, we read that the growing church makes it impossible for the apostles to continue to fulfill this demand of temporal distribution of the welfare for the flock. The Grecian widows were being neglected, and it was no one's fault. It's just they had the ministry of words. So what they did, the institutional emergence of the office of deacons was created in response to this fact that there was distributions, there was temporal needs. The church not only gives spiritual resources, but also temporal provisions for those who are in want, both inside and outside the church. But the ministry, the preacher, the pastor's main ministry is to be that of the word, and we have deacons and finance committees to take care of the other stuff. And Joseph, who was also called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus. So this Joseph is referred only to Barnabas here throughout. He is Paul's. We meet him. He's an instrumental figure. He is the donor of the land of plot of property, which became the disciples' home base and home station. It was outside of the outskirts of Jerusalem, but he was the one, as a Levite, he may or may not have been allowed to own land, whether or not the Levitical law was still in effect. The Levites were strictly speaking to live by the land and tithes, but this was a man of means, so he was a man of commerce, and he came from Cyprus, that is that island nation in the eastern Mediterranean, and the Jews had been settled there since the Maccabean era. Barnabas, and he's going to be a figure. He vouches for Paul to the apostles because they have every reason to be afraid of accepting him, but he plays the intermediary. He is the one who ends up meeting Paul, the Christian monster turned stunned convert, the unlikeliest convert. He vouches for him, and he's also his traveling companion on his first mission journey. And he's also a cousin of John Mark, the author of the book known as Mark, Gospel of Mark. And they have a parting of way. John Mark parts ways from Paul, and Barnabas eventually follows him. And Paul and Mark are unreconciled, but eventually they get it figured out, and it's all well. Having land, sold it, and bought the proceeds, and laid it at the feet of the apostles. So everything he had to give, he gave it all. He had the land, he sold it, and he gave all the money, the profit of the sale at the feet of the apostles. This was going to enable them, their mission, to flourish, because there were temporal needs, wants, concerns, and absences to make. There, a lot of the people were needy, and a lot of poor people do make better Christians because they are refined. They are no strangers to suffering. They are refined in the furnace of affliction. And but we have to look out for them, make sure that they are able to subsist and survive. So the church exists not only as a spiritual hospital, but also a physical one, though not quite the same thing. But in as much as we are able, we are to harbor and heal the hungry, the wearied, the wounded, and the weak. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.